Now, why is this important when we talk about creation? Well, I want to suggest to you in the Lord's church, and those that make statistics of the growth of the church, not only are we in neutral. Remember in the days when we would drive automobiles and they had you'd have a clutch and you'd have a gearbox or what have you, and you'd put in neutral. We're a little bit more used, I think, to put it in N now or D, but we're actually in reverse when it comes to the church growing. And there are some reasons for that. And as we are going to look particularly about Moses and some of his writings, and what we'll do is we'll spend about an hour and we'll have question and answer after each segment. And right around 1:15 or so, or I should say rather 2:15 or so, we'll go right into a 20 or 30 minute break and we'll come back. But basically what I'd like to cover at this segment is our introduction and a little bit of biology in connection with the book of Genesis. Now we'll look at a couple other passages in some other books, but could somebody tell me roughly about what century did Moses live? And how do we know that? Nobody wants to answer that one? Well, that's okay. For instance, we can kind of date Moses. Now, I know some would say because in the book of Exodus, we have the Exodus, of course, from Egypt. And some would say, well, that has to be Ramesses II. But yet there is a passage in 1 Kings chapter 6, the first 4 verses, where it speaks about, during the time of Solomon, 480 years prior. Now we're getting, and I like to round things off, and we can be 20 or 30 years off, but we're getting to about 1500. Now that would put the Moses of the Exodus probably or possibly Thutmose III or Amenhotep, but yet we're without a couple hundred of years, so that just wouldn't fit with Ramesses II. So when we talk about things like this, quite often people would speak about the Bible as if it's some type of archaic, something that is, how should we say, when it comes to contemporary or being in vogue, or I should say rather cosmopolitan, when it comes to knowledge. But yet, if this is true, and we're beginning in the 21st century, we're talking of time of roughly 3,500 years. Now, I don't have to speak a great deal about Charles Darwin, right? Because Charles Darwin came out or published the book in 1859, The Origin of Species. And I think we're all familiar with that. As a matter of fact, I've mentioned when I go to campuses and I'm invited, we get some folks when we ask questions about origins, they like to ask about my background or the author's background. Well, I have a graduate degree in education. I'm also a graduate of one of our schools of preaching in Florida, and I'm pretty close to finishing up. All I need is a thesis and a couple hours of my master's degree. But that's not usually what they want to know. They want to know, where's my PhD? And I thought it would be fair to show you my PhD as we have opportunity. And some of us might have them around the home or around our farm. So one of them, I'm holding my PhD, my post-hole digger. Well, that might not be good enough for some, but yet let's look at another, because you might have some donkeys laying around your farm or your area. So let me represent folks or people that are holding donkeys. Now, I'm not trying to make light of education, but yet I'd like to just break the ice a little bit, because when we speak about the origins, that it's not left solely to biologists or astronomers, or what we would call scientists or science, there is evidence that God would put on this earth. And the difference between us and those that might claim themselves scientists is the fact that we have revealed knowledge. Revealed knowledge. And God in His wisdom would know that if there is evidence, and we're going to briefly and momentarily, we'll get into the days of creation, so to speak, and in statements like reproducing after its own or their own kind. These would be things that are principles that would be just as true 3,500 years ago as they are today, and as we speak about the future. So no, I'm not making light of education, but some folks like to know where my PhD, and I just think it's fair, and I showed it to you. But nonetheless, as we have opportunity, let's turn our attention to some matters. Because in our society, and in particular, now I started school in 1960, and if you're older than I am, you would remember, more than likely, you could probably recite from the book of Matthew the Golden Rule. Today, there is such a difference when it comes to the attitude about the Bible. Is it not right? And today, we would have just as much problems of bringing the Bible into the classroom as we would with illegal substances. And as we talk about origins, and specifically why we're losing so many of our young people today, that our students that go for the most part to the public school system have a worldview that we are not designed by God, but we are products of chance. And we see some of this when it comes to matters like abortion. Why not abort infants if they're not human, if we're just animals? And the only difference between you and I and a squirrel is just the molecular packaging. Why not? And when we speak about morality, we are in the fight of our lives, brethren, and our lives when it comes to the ideas and when it comes to truth. So many are trying to silence, and what they are actually packaging as truth, as we're going to find out, is based upon, well, it's based upon ideas. It's based upon presuppositions that do not exist. It's based upon error. And I want to suggest to you, and as we'll make more discussion, and as we'll examine together, you and I, the evidence that we're going to come away with, and we can conclude correctly. Remember in Scripture, in the 11th chapter of Hebrews, starting in verse 1, that faith is the substance of things not seen. You know, it's interesting to note when we'll take a little bit of time with this, what was known when, for instance, by our Grecian friends back in the day, 4th and 5th centuries, when it came to the concept and idea of atoms. Could Paul be addressing something like that? But yet, when we come to conclusions, faith is built upon substance. And when we speak of substance, we're talking about evidence. And to go contrary to that is nothing more than a leap of faith. And I want to suggest to you, if we look into the Holy Writ, we look into the writings of Moses, we're going to see evidence because it has been revealed. We have revealed knowledge. But those that make presumptions upon things that, well, presumption upon presumption and assumption, we're going to find that that is a leap of faith. But yet it's taught as if it is gospel, if it is true. Well, what saith the evidence? When we ask the question, was it Moses who got it right? Or was it Darwin? Remember, Darwin is not a scientist per se as we would use in the classical term. He was actually in training to be an Anglican preacher. We know certain things about Darwin, and I'm sure you've studied it in school. We won't take a great deal of time with this. But yet, Darwin, on his voyage in His Majesty's service, or Her Majesty's service, the Victorian period, of course, that on the Beagle, going to the Galapagos Islands, came up with this concept and idea, but yet it is not his. We can go back into ancient Greece, and we can find philosophers, we can find those in academia at the time, were trying to answer some of the greatest questions of life. What do we emanate from? I think that's a fair question. And there's going to be two, actually. Now, some would say three. But before we go there, we need to define some of our terms. And let's talk about this a little bit. When we ponder such questions, Darwinism looks at man as an animal. As a matter of fact, if you take time to look on YouTube these days, I think most of us probably heard the name Richard Dawkins. He's a prolific writer. And he champions the philosophy, so to speak, of Charles Darwin, because man had emanated, right, from the primordial pond. He was at first a fish, and then he turned into a reptile, and he came out, during that time, he came out of this primordial pond, and then he evolved to what we have today. Well, man is nothing more than an animal. Now, what is usually being promoted, like Mr. Dawkins, as a matter of fact, we could spend a little bit of time and discuss, and I think all of us know who, well, let me just see a show of hands. How many have ever heard of Bill Nye the Science Guy? Can I see a everyone, right? Just about everyone. I believe he was, what, on PBS? If not, a very popular program. We all know who Sagan is, right, in Nova. And today we have Dr. Tyson, who has basically taken over his mantle. He is an astrophysicist. But what's in common? What is in common is, when we speak of a worldview, that you cannot be, quote unquote, scientific, you cannot be educated, you cannot be knowledgeable, and hold the view that we're created by God within 10,000 years. As a matter of fact, what's being promoted today, men like Mr. Dawkins and Bill Nye, is that if you teach this to your children, not only are you harming them, but also, and we need to think about this, also, they'll never be involved in science. But what does the record state when it comes to history? Now, that's an interest that I have, and I know that you have as well, or at least a portion of it. From the biblical standpoint, we find from revealed knowledge the motif of the Scripture, and separate and apart from a naturalistic viewpoint, like some of our Grecian friends, like Darwin or Darwinism, that we have been created in the image of God. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. So this is considered something, as we speak of Darwinism, that man is just nothing more than an animal. And the only difference is the complexity of the molecular packaging. But yet, when we go back into history, what model do we have when we speak of tyranny? For instance, we go back 70 years ago, and maybe even a little before that, when we have the axis of power, or some would say the axis of evil. Remember Imperial Japan, and we had the fascistic dictator Mussolini, and of course, as we speak about Hitler. Well, when we deal with socialism, communism, fascism, Mao Zedong, Stalin, tens, if not hundreds, of millions of people in the 20th century. Where do they get that worldview from? They get that worldview that man has no intrinsic value. And why not? If I have a dissident and I'm Joseph Stalin and I cause famine that causes the death by starvation of tens of millions of people, and they disagree with me, and they're no different than an animal, well, why not? Or today, a reason why we have problems with immigration, and it's a complicated matter, I realize this, but think back to 1973 with Roe v. Wade. What will happen when we put to death the innocent, and when we speak about the infant, and we have a vacuum where there should be workers today, but they all have been aborted, and in a vacuum, somebody will fill that. But why not abort children if they're nothing more than an animal? So it's not correct, at least, to state that if somebody does not believe in this as the truth, Darwinism has a direct link to tyrannical political systems. And there was a time in this world that in some of these nations, they would have fences with people and towers with guns, and you tried to escape your own country, they'd kill you. But why not, if they're nothing more than an animal? So when we look at creationism, and we look at how God has ordered, we find that man is, and mankind, men and women, are elevated, and they are to have dominion over the earth, and we speak about the individual. Now, what systems do we find that hold that type of scenario, that type of philosophy? Well, liberty. Liberty. And let's just take a moment, because it elevates life. How many in here, and I'm sure maybe over the world there might be some hospitals named after Darwin, but generally when we look at hospitals, and we go back especially, as we call the Reformation, and even before, what did people with a worldview that say that and understand that we're created in the image of God and the importance of the individual, the importance of human life, they have a tendency when sickness occurs, what do they build? Help me with this. They build hospitals, don't they? Medical centers. When we drive through this great land, don't we usually see, and we might disagree with our denominational friends, I certainly do, but we might see Baptist Hospital, right? St. John's, St. Mark's. Now, some would say, well, today they're owned by board meetings, but that's not the point. How many, when we talk about this type of scenario when it comes to Darwinism, and I'll write this out on the board and maybe for your thought, and we can have some discussion and question and answer. How many socialist, fascist, you ever heard of fascist hospital? Fascist medical center? Why? Because if they don't look at the individual as important, well, why not let them die? Why not? So it is an important matter when we discuss where we come from. Now, I mention this, and I'm not trying to be political, but there are changes in our society that need to be discussed. The reason I'm saying this is, when we speak about the political systems of men, you have basically, and we'll look at extremes. On this side of the spectrum, you have anarchy, and we know what anarchy is, right? Now, don't tell me it's when your children are in their bedrooms, right? But you do see a little bit of that, right? A lot of disorder, right? And anarchy is no government control. People walking around with guns, taking their law in their own hands. It's dangerous. It's not good, is it? Then you have on the other side totalitarianism, where the government has complete control, right? I mean, they put folks up with guns, and you try to escape, they'll shoot you, right? So our founding fathers studied, like the Roman Republic and the democracy mechanisms of Greece. And somewhere around in the middle, that's where some of our political philosophies have helped formulate our great land. Now, when it comes to our political parties, for the most part, they're two. We're not going to talk about Whigs and what have you. But yet, for the most part, we would say the Republican Party was right to center, the Democratic Party left to center. But what's going on today? Well, some things what we might call progressive, but before we go there, in a totalitarian type of government, this is where you get things like socialism, things like communism, things like fascism. And these are all systems that the government has total power. As a matter of fact, communism almost is something or a system where the state is deified. But yet what has happened in our society? Well, our political parties have gone this way. They're called progressive. But not only have our Democrats have done that, so have our Republicans have done that. So where do people go when it comes to liberty, when it comes to the importance of the individual? Well, they get that from the book of Moses. They get that from the Bible. Where do they get totalitarianism? They get that from Darwin. Now, some would say, yeah, but Brother Friel, you know, when we talk about unpleasantries in the world, and even with slavery, what happened in this country, that book that Darwin in 1859 published, well, we had those kinds of problems before that. But see, it's a worldview. It's a worldview, and it really comes down to either we're created as individuals by God, that we have intrinsic value, or we're nothing more than a bunch of animals like squirrels and rabbits, and why not? I mean, just if somebody disagrees or somebody gets sick, euthanasia, or choices that people make and we have abortions, I mean, why not? Why not? And now we're racking up tens of millions of murders in the name of freedom by abortion. And this nation, as well as all other nations, will have to stand before its Creator. So this is just more or less a very brief descriptor of what's going on and why it's so important to study where we came from and who we are. Let's notice something else, if we may, as we go a little bit. We're going to talk about terms again. And evolution, and there's about 9 different terms, and some use it in different ways, but when we speak of macroevolution, naturalistic evolution, organic evolution, we're talking about life emanating from molecules, that some would say, to man. We're talking about chance, no design and no designer. When we speak about microevolution, which probably is not a very good term, but we're really talking about mutations or variations. Going back, and we'll make more mention of it, some of us probably remember in grade school, and by the way, in the 60s, at least where I was at, both the evolutionary model and the creation model had somewhat of an equal chance of being discussed. Today, not so. Today, they're more like our fascist friends over here, where there's no discussion. And we're also starting to see this with this so-called pseudoscience in the environment, are we not? And their argument is that all of the evidence is in, and everybody believes it, and it's all interrelated, and it's basically from a computer model. You know, it's strange, is it not, when we see these kinds of formulation of ideas, and we can understand the tendencies. But microevolution, mutations. We live in an agricultural area. How many in here have ever lived on the farm? Can I see a show of hands? Well, a few of us have. Rest of us are city folk. But we've driven by, haven't we? And we've seen cows, right? And what is something that when we talk about cattle or bovine or cows, what are some of the attributes of a cow? They eat green grass, don't they? And for the most part, depending on the kind of grass, they'll, for the most part, will give white milk, sometimes yellow, depending on the grass, but they all go, for the most part, moo, don't they? But then you got different kinds of cattle, don't you? They have some that they're designed where, I mean, they're almost to your shins, right? And there's some that are just, well, they're humongous. They weigh a couple tons. But they're still cattle. They're still cows, right? And then they have variation. They come in different shapes, heights. They come in different colors, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about the human genome. And of course, it's so broad that when we speak of people, we come in different heights, right? Shapes, sizes, and colors. But we're all people. We're all human. And we will talk a little bit about Paul's discourse in Athens in Acts chapter 17, where he said we came from one blood. So when we talk about race, some would say, you know, what's your race? Where do you come from? And try to identify. It's interesting that we get from the Bible, we're all of one blood. We're the human race separate from the animals, right? Where man tries to put white, black, yellow, red, polka dot, purple, right? Oh, I'm sorry, was that E.T.? But nonetheless, I know it's kind of late in the day, but maybe that one went over your head. But nonetheless, when we talk about this, we're speaking of humanity. We'll get into that a little bit more. Theistic evolution is a compromise. I'm sure we could mention some brethren throughout the years that have gone haywire on this for whatever reason. And some evolutionists, by the way, have looked at the possibility of theistic evolution. But one reason it is not true is because even in the internal evidence of the book of Moses, if one species is to reproduce after its kind, how in the world can we attribute God of doing something contrary to what he has spoken? Right? Also, when it comes to the time matter, we're going to discuss that. It just doesn't fit. So we're left again with two questions. Where did we originate from? By chance or by a creator? Oh, by the way, is everybody all right? Everybody's doing good. Good. We also have what's called the Big Bang Theory, and we have to be really careful with that. And we're going to talk about this when we get into astronomy. A divergence of ideas, whether there were light years of matter, or some have even said even smaller than the dot on a printed page, and it exploded. And of course, we'll ask questions like, what exploded? And where did that come from? But yet, that's generally considered the Big Bang when it comes to, I guess in a matter of speaking, cosmic evolution, so to speak. But yet, some would use this term that when God created, and we're going to find about putting the stars and the moons and what have you, that was an explosive event. We want to keep mind of that. And of course, the creation theory, and what's important is that both are theories, both Darwinism and the creation theory, because, let me ask this. This year, who in here is old enough to remember the old Bullwinkle and Rocky cartoons? Can we see some hands? Oh, man. You remember Sherman? He hung around with Mr. Peabody, right? And Mr. Peabody was this really smart dog, right? And then when they get on to discussion of history, they go back to the way back machine, right? Right? Well, we can't go with them to the way back machine and view and watch how the creation of the world came about. So we have to go by evidence. Both are theories, and I'm not even going to say that Darwinism is a theory. I agree with Christian scientists that it's more of a hypothesis. But nonetheless, we'll address some of that. So this is important to keep that in mind. So when we put it all together, Darwin, lots of time, and we're going to discuss this. We've spent a little bit of time with that. Darwin is time plus chance equals life. And of course, creation, we have a creator. And when evidence is given, when evidence is given, that means that God would have the foreknowledge that folks in the future and that how technology would advance, people would put to test these principles. And I want to suggest to you a reason why we can be confident with the Word of God is that these principles, and the Bible is not written as a science book or a science textbook, but when we have scientific foreknowledge and statements, they're always true. And there are things that we don't know, and there are things in the future that will be discovered. We're in a precipice of an exciting time, which I agree with some of my Darwinist friends that we should only make conclusions based upon evidence. So when we speak of the age of the earth, is it young versus old? The same evidence that exists for it, both sides can see. It goes back to a worldview, and a worldview that will not tolerate discussion, a worldview that will not tolerate divergence. As a matter of fact, some of us growing up remember people on the other side talking about, oh, let's be open-minded. Do you know some folks that when we get into matters like homosexual marriage that always clamor and claim tolerance, that when they quote-unquote come to power are the most intolerant of people? You ever notice that? You ever notice that in academia? What they call classically liberal? Always preach what? Openness, open-mindedness, discussion. The most intolerant of people. As a matter of fact, Mr. Dawkins, Bill Nye the Science Guy, Dr. Tyson, and a host of others, they take a great deal of pride and opportunity to lampoon, to minimalize, to marginalize any section of truth when it comes to the Bible. But yet, what did they say about truth? It's usually the most shocking or the last thing to shock you, right? When we look at the writings of Moses, 3,500 years ago, in the absence of a laboratory. Now, I'm from New England, so I might say laboratory, but yet we understand what that is. Absence of these things, the only way that we can explain it is, of course, through revelation. Now, we'll have opportunity here in about 30 minutes to have some discussion. I'd like to go on and discuss biology, but biology by no means is the only discipline of science. And science, I believe, comes from the Latin, meaning knowledge. So we have to define our terms with that as well. Because quite often, scientists will claim that the worldview of Darwinism, and he's looked upon as a prophet, so to speak. And we have modern-day apostles like Charles Dawkins and others, Bill Nye, that when we speak about such things, there's no question because everybody has a consensus. But it's interesting to note that this consensus is built upon conformity. And they want our children to believe this, but they will not deal in, or I should say discuss and debate an honorable manner about the subject matter. Because I want to suggest to you when it comes to evolution and Darwinism, there's not a shred of evidence for it. And when times come, hopefully we'll go into a cycle where people will go back to looking at evidence and seeing what Moses revealed. And people come to a conclusion, and a correct conclusion. There are going to be a lot of folks wondering, this is probably the greatest hoax that was ever sprung upon mankind